Hi, welcome everybody to Solid Rock, where we stress test the Gospels. My name is Mate de Brossi, and I shall be interviewing my friend and neighbor, Peter Murfitt. Hello, Peter.
Hi, Matty.
Very good. We have already dealt with the literary nature or genre of the Gospels in previous podcasts. We concluded that they are historically reliable. They are biographies of Jesus written in the Greek and Roman style of the times, and they are based on eyewitness testimonies. Dear listeners, if you are so inclined, please go back to the previous podcasts or the video casts and the podcasts available on the Solid as a Rock website. So, Peter, today, we're going back to our first love, the reliability of the Gospels after a period of examining the book of Revelations.
Yes, today we will recall the method we used to determine the origins of the Gospels, and we shall apply it to Mark and to Matthew.
Okay, so let's summarize your method, Peter, for determining the origins of the Gospels.
Well, the first two steps of my method are those used by most researchers in Gospel studies. Firstly, we examine the evidence from the Gospel documents themselves, what historians and theologians call the internal evidence. Secondly, we feed in information we have gleaned from the Acts of the Apostles, from the New Testament letters, and from the historians, notably Josephus, Suetonius, Tacitus, Irenaeus, Papias, and Eusebius. This is known as the external evidence.
All right. As I understand it, you add a third step.
Yes, I attempt to trace the whereabouts over time of the major figures involved, like Peter, Paul, Mark, Luke, Silas, etc., in timeline charts. Because, as we all know from watching police series on television, in order to commit a crime, you need motive, means, and opportunity. In the same way, the authors of the Gospels had to have motive, means, and opportunity.
Surely motive presents no problem. We have already seen that they were writing biographies of Jesus so that all the world should know about him. In any case, these timeline charts enable us to zero in on means and opportunity. Is that it?
Yes, that's it. There is one other tool which Richard Borkham introduced, which is called inclusio evidence. An author underlines the importance of the testimony of a person by citing his or her name first and last in the document. So this is a form of internal evidence.
Right, so that's the method. We've already dealt with the origins of Luke and Acts in previous videos and podcasts, as I mentioned. And please go back to them and listen to them again. If people want more details, they should buy Peter's book, Solid Rock, Stress Testing the Gospels. Let's examine the origins of Mark now, Peter. Where do we start?
Once again, we may begin with the inclusio evidence. The first and last disciple to be mentioned is Simon Peter in chapter 1 verse 16 and in chapter 16 verse 7. So Mark indicates that he depends on the eyewitness testimony of Peter. There is also in Mark's Gospel an interesting plural to singular narrative device of which we will cite one example out of 21. They went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes when Jesus got out of the boat. That's chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. The pattern is they concerns the movements of Jesus and his disciples when they come to a new place, but the transition to him or Jesus is immediate. We conclude that firstly, Mark's Gospel is essentially the Gospel of the 12, because that is the they which is concerned. Secondly, these passages read even more naturally if the they was originally we. This is potentially hugely significant because it suggests, and we will see later that there is excellent external evidence to back this up, that behind Mark's Gospel we can hear the voice of Peter's preaching.
Okay, right. So in all this, the internal evidence is strong for Mark depending on the eyewitness testimony of the apostle Peter.
Yes, the internal evidence shows that Mark wrote for a Gentile, non-Jewish and non-Aramaic audience. He provides explanations for his readers of Jewish customs which are not present in the parallel passages in Matthew. Mark also shows a preference for Latin or Roman technical and military terms. For example, legion, praetorium, centurion, speculator, flagare, denarius, quadrans. This suggests that Mark was aiming at an Italian or Roman audience.
All right, so now we turn to the external evidence.
Yes, and it's now a moment to introduce Papias. Papias was bishop of Hierapolis, a city in the Lycus Valley in the Roman province of Asia, that's present-day Turkey, not far from Laodicea and Colossae. Papias belonged to a generation that had been in touch with the apostles. He was personally acquainted with the daughters of Philip the Evangelist, who was one of the seven. This Philip spent the last years of his life in Hierapolis, and two of his daughters, who were well known as prophets, also lived out the rest of their lives there, unmarried. From Philip's daughter, he learned some stories about the apostles. Papias wrote between AD 100 and AD 107, but his recollections date from around AD 80. Papias, in his prologue, explains the following. I made it a point to inquire what were the declarations of the elders, what was said by Andrew, Peter or Philip, what by Thomas, James, John, Matthew, or any other disciples of our Lord.
Okay, but what information does Papias actually give us?
Papias talks of the Gospels of Mark and Matthew. Here goes. And John the presbyter also said this, Mark, being the interpreter of Peter, whatsoever he recorded he wrote with great accuracy, but not, however, in the order in which it was spoken or done by our Lord, but as before said, he was in company with Peter, who gave him such instructions as was necessary, but not to give a history of our Lord's discourses. Wherefore Mark has not erred in anything by writing some things as he has recorded them, for he was carefully attentive to one thing, not to pass by anything that he had heard or to state anything falsely in these accounts. Of Matthew he had stated as follows, Matthew composed his history in the Hebrew dialect, and everyone translated it as he was able. Papias' statement on Mark's Gospel is the earliest explicit claim that Peter's preaching lies behind this Gospel. This links up very nicely with what we found in the internal evidence that often the they in Mark's Gospel should surely mean more naturally we, because in reality we are dealing with Peter's preaching.
All right. What other external evidence do we have concerning Mark's Gospel?
Oh, we got lots. Eusebius quotes Clement of Alexandria, who said that the people in the church in Rome entreated Mark as Peter's companion to leave them a monument in writing of Peter's preaching. Peter was delighted with the result and authorized it for reading in the churches. Origen talks of Mark's as the second gospel, who composed it as Peter explained it to him. The anti-Marcionite and monarchian prologues, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Ephraim, Epiphanes, and Jerome all back up the idea that the author was John Mark, one-time companion of Barnabas, Paul and Peter, that he derived his material from the preaching of Peter, with whom he was closely associated, and that the work was compiled in Rome, or more generally in Italy. The only remaining question on all this evidence is whether Mark wrote the Gospel before or after Peter's death. The view of Clement of Alexandria that Mark wrote his Gospel before Peter's death seems convincing.
All right. So the earliest and overwhelming evidence from the early church is that Mark wrote his Gospel in Rome as a record of Peter's preaching before Peter was crucified in AD 64-65. And this fits the internal evidence extremely well. He probably wrote it in Rome between AD 55 and AD 59.
That's it, Matty.
Okay. Right. Let's go on to the origins of Matthew's Gospel, starting first with the internal evidence.
Unfortunately, there's no clear inclusio evidence to guide us. The Gospel seems to have been written by a Jewish Christian for a largely Jewish Christian readership. There are Aramaic terms which are not translated, such as raka, a term of contempt, or korbanas, referring to the temple treasury. Unlike Mark, Matthew does not explain Jewish customs such as hand washing because he seems to assume that Israeli readers are familiar with them. The formula quotations are an important feature of the Gospel. Matthew uses these quotations of the Old Testament to demonstrate that Jesus is the fulfillment of the hopes of Israel. We've already shown that the three synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark and Luke, were written before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. After AD 70, the discussion of the temple tax, that's chapter 17 verses 24 to 27, would have presented no interest whatsoever and would indeed have been misleading. Because after the destruction of the temple, the tax was diverted by the Romans to the upkeep of the temple of Jupiter in Rome. The same arguments to two other passages found only in Matthew which refer to the temple. They would have meant nothing or would have been misleading after AD 70. So, the internal evidence points to the writer of Matthew's Gospel being a Jewish Christian writing for a predominantly Jewish Christian audience before AD 70.
Okie dokie. So much for the internal evidence. What about the external evidence on Matthew?
Well, we come back to Papias. He has the earliest evidence on Matthew's Gospel. Of Matthew, he had stated as follows: Matthew composed his history in the Hebrew dialect, and everyone translated it as he was able. However, Papias was not alone in saying that Matthew was first written in Hebrew. Irenaeus and Origen said the same. The explanation seems to come from Eusebius himself. Matthew, also having first proclaimed the gospel in Hebrew, went on the point of going also to other nations, committed it to writing in his native tongue, and thus supplied the want of his presence to them by his writings. Clearly, Matthew was first written in Hebrew or Aramaic, probably in Palestine or Syria, but not necessarily in Antioch. However, its translation into Greek quickly superseded it. An examination of Irenaeus' evidence suggests that Matthew was written between AD 55 and AD 61. Finally, it must be stated that the Gospel of Matthew has never in the history of the early church been associated with anyone else but Matthew, Levi from Capernaum, who was a border tolls collector for Herod Antipas. It has also, throughout this period, been regarded as the first of the Gospels to be written.
Right. The internal evidence points to the writer of Matthew's Gospel being a Jewish Christian, writing for a predominantly Jewish Christian audience before AD 70, probably in Palestine or Syria. The external evidence, which is not copious as you mentioned, tends to confirm this, raising the point that the Gospel was almost certainly written originally in a Semitic dialect before being translated into the Greek text which has come down to us. From Irenaeus, we deduced that Matthew was written between AD 55 and 61. The Gospel of Matthew has never in the history of the early church been associated with anyone else but Matthew, Levi from Capernaum, who was a border tolls collector for Herod Antipas. It has also, throughout this period, been regarded as the first of the Gospels to be written.
Yep, that's it, Matty. The remarkable result of this investigation is that Matthew, Mark and Luke were all written at about the same time. This suggests that they were largely written independently, although in my book I show that Luke probably had Matthew and Mark, or at least a testimony of Peter, when he wrote towards the end. The early church fathers and historians never mention that one gospel writer used the material of another. Although this is admittedly an argument from silence, it is nevertheless perhaps significant.
Okay, Peter, that's all very enlightening and goes against the established wisdom of Mark being written first and everybody else copying him.
Yes, that's because the theologians in the 20th century majored on rather dubious theological arguments and neglected the historians.
All right, thank you very much, Peter. And I just want to remind the listeners again that if you want to dig deeper into this subject, then I refer you to Peter's book, Solid Rock, Testing the Gospels. And Peter, how can people obtain this book?
Well, they can go onto the Advantage Books website, or they can go onto Amazon and find it there.
Perfect, very good. So next time, I guess we go to the origins of John's Gospel. Is that right?
Yep, you've got it in one, Matty.
All right. God bless you, Peter, and God bless all the listeners. And see you the next time.
Yes, God bless you all.
Thanks for listening. The podcast Solid Rock was prepared by Peter Murphy and Mate de Brossi. Timothy Bannock helped us with the technical aspects. The music you heard at the beginning and at the end was composed by Benjamin de Brossi. We thank Benjamin, and we're using the music with his permission. Thanks again for joining us, and please join us again for our next podcasts.